Hey guys, we've been tasked with summarizing, not retelling one of the chapters, which means I'm going to really just be pulling out the key points that um, I thought and that will be really necessary for my kind of take two. But I chose to talk about motivation because I think for me, this is such an important thing as a Chinese teacher to realize that a lot of my students, I think, have a lack of motivation because they just have to do Chinese. So I was really fascinated to talk about this part. So, what is motivation? A lot of this chapter revolved around a scholar named Gardner and his idea of the highly motivated individual. Well, motivation is exactly what you think it is, right? I don't think it needs a lot of explanation. Um, but one of the things that I would like to say, and this is taken right from the text, I'm just going to talk about these points, is these three dimensions of motivation. Number one, what they call motivational intensity, or what we would probably just call normally effort, right? How much effort are you putting into learning this language, right? If you have high effort and you're studying a language like Chinese, you're studying lots of Chinese characters every day, and you're doing what we would call the work. The next thing is enjoyment, and this is probably one for me that I think is the most controversial. But I do understand this idea of being highly motivated and what exactly enjoyment means could vary from person um, to person. But I definitely know that in my language learning journey that there were definitely moments of love and of hate. And not towards any particular person, but to like the language as a whole, and how difficult it was for me to do that. So I do understand that enjoyment can definitely play a part in motivating and definitely work harder when we're feeling good about what we're doing. And the last point is a desire to learn. And this can really be understood as the investment, right? Why am I here? The unction to do this is extraordinarily important. So if you rate high in all three areas, Gardner would say, hey, you're a very motivated individual, and thus you'd be more likely to achieve mastery in a shorter period of time than someone who is unmotivated. Again, that's not to say that the unmotivated individual cannot achieve mastery, but not with the speed and proficiency of or efficiency of someone who's highly motivated. The chapter also spends a lot of time talking about antecedents. And I think antecedents, in terms of motivation, is why we are here, right? So, we talked about attributes before, but now we're talking about the whys of why we're here, and how those whys can affect what's going on. So um, we have attitudes towards L2 community and its speakers as an antecedent. And I'm just going to be using myself as an example, what I thought about China, or what someone may think about Spanish or French or whatever. And it's really fascinating, I think, because that in and of itself is very complicated. And I think, especially when you're learning languages like French or Spanish, where you may have a very positive view, for example, if you're studying French, of maybe Francophone African nations, but not a very positive view of France itself. So I think that's really interesting. Integrativeness, I don't want to get too deep into that, um, because we're going to talk about it in just the next slide. But basically, and I'll just read straight from here, a genuine interest in learning the second language in order to come closer to another language community. That's a hot take, and has been a hot take. And in the 90s, they kind of had a tussle about it, and we'll talk about that. Attitudes toward instructional setting. I think it makes sense that I jokingly say, I quote that commercial, happy cows make happy milk, happy students learn better, right? And I don't think that can be ignored. If a student doesn't like you, they're not going to learn from you. And I think that's very powerful, that a lot of this motivation is an internal calculus that happens in regard to something external. Orientations, these are the reasons for learning the L2, in which turn may influence the intensity and quality of motivation. Obviously, orientations covers a very broad network of ideas, but again, how are you orienting yourself in relation to the learning? Social support, I think this is a big one, especially when talking with children. This is, I get parents asking, how do I help my kid learn? So on and so forth. Intergroup contact, the potential and actual contact, as well as how those experiences are remembered. So, this is really interesting, I think, in the American context for my school, for example, where we are, where this is literally saying these interactions that you have with the L2, are they positive or negative, and how that affects, how that precedes your motivation and or learning. Ethnovitality, the sociopolitical presence of the language in the community. It can include more general other geopolitical factors such as globalization and tourism. I think for us in the United States, especially when talking about Mandarin, we're talking about rivalry. Though I think tourism definitely plays a part. I know a big motivation for our kids is when they get into middle school, they have the opportunity to go on a trip to China. So that's a huge motivation for them. Self confidence with using the language. Um, this includes the communicative anxiety and the self perception of communicable competence. This is really, really big. I think chapter 9 deals a lot more with that. But obviously, language learning is a process. And so when you acquire some of that language, your ability to then use it is going to affect your further study. I know, again, leaning on my own when talking about Chinese and my students, they can get so discouraged. And I have to be so careful to allow for correction and praise to be given in unequal parts. A lot more praise, a lot less correction, because that can affect students' confidence for sure. So the hot take, integrativeness. There are three components of what integrativeness means. And it's, in essence, to use part of the word we don't integrate, how the learner views themselves in relationship to the L2 language and its community. And this being one of the a lot of scholarship has gone around this integrativeness, and we'll talk about the pushback that Gardner gets in the 90s. But to just hone in on this integrativeness, three kind of three components here: favorable attitudes towards L2 speakers, general interest in foreign languages, and low ethnocentrism. And three here, an endorsement of reasons for learning the L2 related to interaction with L2 members, or in Gardner's terms, an integrative orientation. And the example given here is, studying French is important to me because it will allow me to meet and converse more with varied people. And I think for a lot of languages, there is this kind of blanket idea for the reason why I'm studying the language. What connects me? You know, I don't know if people really analyze why they learn math or why they learn social studies. But I feel like people feel a need to defend the reason why they are studying this particular language out of other languages, even when maybe that's the only language that was offered. There's still a need for those, particularly more motivated ones, to explain, why am I doing this? Uh, and so this led to a burgeoning of scholarship around this particular idea. But there were some issues with it. One in particular that I immediately thought of, and others that I did not think of. And let's jump into how Gardner's idea of motivation comes into question. So in the 90s, Gardner's this kind of model of motivation comes into question. And from this, there's a burgeoning of many different psychological theories around why that was the case. But I think that um, I think that there's a lot there, and there's two ideas. One, is the idea for more context. This idea of it being based, a lot of his research being based in the French, English, Canadian kind of divide and split is extraordinarily limiting. Right? It's very narrowing. And so more context have been used. One that was mentioned in this particular chapter talked about an getting the views of spoken Arabic in Israeli schools, while how apropos for the time we live in. And many of the reasons the children gave were kind of necessity, pragmatic, even peace oriented, though there were some that said, hey, we need to be able to fight the enemies. So, this idea of integrativeness, particularly, you don't have to like someone. As a matter of fact, hate can be an extraordinarily good motivator for studying these ideas. It's one of the reasons why when people ask me about my motivation in studying Chinese, I say, well, it doesn't matter which way the relationship goes. Either way, you can't ignore a billion people. And whether they're friends, enemies, or frenemies, it will be important for the United States to have that skill set. So I think that's extraordinarily more important. And there's so many things I think of, Haiti right now and the many immigrants that will probably be flooding Latin America and probably the United States as its collapse becomes more cemented, and it's kind of already made itself evident. What is their motivation going to be to learn Spanish or English based on their situation? It has nothing to do with this integrativeness, right? It's a need to survive. And I think survival is one of the greatest motivating factors. Um, so this, so Gardner's idea of motivation being called into question again opens up conversation for more context, and two has led to this burgeoning of different theories. So that's a wrap for kind of the brief summary of the chapter. And in this next slide, and then we'll be done. I'm going to talk about my motivation and kind of answer some of the questions um, that were posed by our professor. So I'm going to try to keep this somewhat brief and limit myself to 3 minutes. I've got a timer here to keep me to that. But the question posed was, do you think that the aptitude, motivation, personality, extroversion, introversion, affect, willingness, and necessity to communicate, desire to be correct, field independence, cognitive styles, or learning styles influenced your learning and the achieved result in any way? And so, I think about how much to share of this story given the time constraint. Maybe I need to push to 4 minutes. But you know, when I was in China, or I tell or here, and I tell people that, oh, I speak Chinese, or they hear me speak Chinese, even native speakers, I tell them, oh, I was there for 2.5 years, and then I studied 2 years before that, and they always go, wow, 你是天才, you must be a genius. And I personally don't think anything could be further from the truth. Um, Particularly when I got to China, I went from being an all A student with a 3.9 GPA, consistently getting A's, very familiar with my environment in the American academic system, to barely passing classes, which in China is a 60%. I mean, I praised myself for some of my 62s and 65s because at least I passed. I passed the test, and that was enough to keep me moving forward. Since I talked about motivation, I will go there. Um, I went to China after my scholarship ran dry here. So I was deeply motivated by the potential sense of failure that I did not get my bachelor's degree, that, moving forward, I would not have what I needed to be successful. That was a huge motivating factor. It influenced the effort that I put in. I generally had a very positive view of China and Chinese people. And I never really associate personally um, the misdeeds of individuals in a society to the society itself. Um, when I, so that particular that idea was not particularly huge. Um, I probably had a uptick in ethnocentrism in some sense when going. Yeah, I'm pushing the 4 minutes when being in China, because I thought, hey, I mean, at an international school, I thought, why are we doing things this way? We should do things this way. And they would tell me, oh, well, we have to do it this way because this is China. And I thought, well, man, most of the people, all the people here, except for the teachers and the staff, aren't even Chinese. And I thought, my country is one that's made up of all these groups of people. A small example um, was me learning how to describe different foods because we had, friends who were Muslim, students who were Muslim or Hindu. They had all these dietary restrictions, and you ordered, 10 pizzas from the place, and they're all pepperoni. Well, that's an issue. Or it's pepperoni and beef, right? So we're excluding people. And so another motivation for me was advocacy. And I think my personality, you know, really played a part into that. Seeing how others struggled, I definitely think that I do have an aptitude for languages. That's probably deeply rooted in my how I perceive language, even my L1. I definitely have a personality, and I was not afraid to go for it. And I think so that personality and my extrovertedness in combination with the desire and the necessity to communicate. I firmly, firmly believe, which is why in my curriculum design course, I'm designing a course for a study abroad. The best way to learn a language is to put someone in a situation where they have no choice but to sink or swim. And even if they don't wind up swimming and they're just paddling their way through, that's still okay. And because of that, I think you gain a kind of level of organic authenticity that may not come from someone who is extraordinarily book smart and they know how the language works and maybe they can even be understood, but there's a lack of personality in the language. And so, when people hear me speak Mandarin, they can almost always guess, oh, he's from north. He learned in northeastern China. He lived there. Um, and so, my last note about learning styles is I don't care how you learn best. You can reinforce, you know, your conversations with people out in the wild, so to speak, as we used to say, or rather in the natural environment in a place like China, which is how I learned. And I truly don't believe that I could have learned the language to the level that I have it now had I not gone to the country. And it's about priorities. For me in America, China was a nice to have, versus in China, not only was it required academically, but it was necessary for me to be able to function in the society. And so, because of that, I was able to very quickly achieve a good level of mastery. I just recently took my OPI, crossing my fingers for the WPT, and then the OPI got advanced high. And I was felt very proud about that. Then I realized that there are other exams, like the one for the Defense Department, that go far beyond even that level. And so that was humbling. And so now I have a desire to achieve that level. So I hope that answered kind of in some my ideas around this. See you guys next week.